When the blood had dried and the man on the floor was breathing again, the CIA didn't send flowers. They sent 2 agents in dark suits who smelled like airport coffee and old authority, and they told Sloane Merritt she wasn't allowed to leave the building until she answered one question. Where did you learn to do that? Sloane looked down at her hands. There was still blood under her thumbnail. She hadn't had time to scrub it out properly. I read, she said. The taller agent, the one who had introduced himself as Agent Farrow, didn't blink. He just wrote something in his notebook and said, "We're going to need more than that." The Hargrove Regional Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia, wasn't the kind of place that made the news. It was the kind of place that kept the lights on with fundraiser dinners and prayer chains and the sheer stubbornness of nurses who had been working the same floor for 23 years. It had 1 CT scanner that sometimes worked and 2 trauma bays that were almost always full on Friday nights. Sloane had been working the intake desk for 7 months. Before that, she'd been nowhere. Or at least that's what her employment file said. She was 29. She wore her brown hair in a low ponytail that never came loose. She had a small scar on her left forearm that she covered with her sleeve even in summer, and she had a way of going very still when something was happening that other people found unsettling without being able to explain why. The other intake clerks thought she was quiet. The nurses thought she was efficient. Nobody had asked her much beyond that. She made decent coffee. She remembered patient names. She always showed up on time. That was enough, most days. That was exactly what she needed it to be. It was a Tuesday in late October when the ambulance came in hot from the interstate with a man who should have already been dead. Sloane heard the radio call before anyone else did because she was standing closest to the dispatch speaker, refilling the tray of intake forms that always ran low after lunch. She processed the information in the time it took her to set the stack of papers down on the counter. Blunt force trauma to the chest. Suspected tension pneumothorax. BP dropping. ETA 4 minutes. She walked around the counter. Merritt. The charge nurse, a tall woman named Beverly who had the bearing of someone who had survived far worse than this hospital, looked up from her station. "What are you doing?" "They're bringing in a tension pneumo," Sloane said. "Do you have a 14 gauge on the crash cart?" Beverly stared at her. "That's not do you have one?" The ambulance bay doors burst open. Sloane had already moved. The man's name, she would learn later, was Staff Sergeant Caleb Oren, and he had been on his way back to a base in Virginia after 2 weeks of leave, when the driver of a logging truck ran a red light on Route 50 and removed that plan entirely. He was 34. He was 6 feet and 200 pounds of muscle, and now he was gray-faced and drowning in his own chest cavity, and the 2 paramedics wheeling him in were both saying different things at the same volume, and neither of them was saying anything useful. "Bilateral breath sounds are absent on the right," Sloane said. "Not loudly, just clearly. The way you say a thing when you already know it and need the room to catch up." One of the paramedics, young, maybe 23, still had his academy haircut, turned and looked at her like she had appeared out of the wall. "Who are you?" "Someone who can help him." She held out her hand toward Beverly, who was standing 3 feet away with the crash cart. "Beverly, the 14 gauge. Beverly, to her enormous credit, handed it over without another word. What Sloane did in the next 4 minutes was not in any intake clerk's job description. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right side, with the kind of precision that doesn't come from reading a textbook once. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing did not change. She talked while she worked, not to the room, not to herself, but to Caleb, whose eyes were half open and tracking nothing, because she had been told once, a long time ago, that you always talk to them, because sometimes the sound of a voice is the thing they're still holding on to. "Stay with me," she said. "You've been through worse than this. I don't know what that was, but I know you have." The needle went in. The air hissed out. Caleb Oren's chest rose. The room went completely silent. Then the monitor beeped, a long, steady, indignant beep, as if annoyed at having been ignored, and his blood pressure began its slow climb back towards something survivable. The ER physician, A bearded man named Dr. Keene, who had arrived somewhere in the middle of all this and had the good sense to let it finish, looked at Sloane across the gurney. "You decompressed him," he said. "Yes. You're the intake clerk." "Yes." He looked at her hands, then at Caleb's chest, which was moving properly for the first time since the logging truck, then back at her. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He seemed to be saying it to himself. He pulled on gloves and stepped in to take over, and Sloane stepped back, and that was that. She thought that was going to be that. She went back to the intake desk. She washed her hands twice. She refilled the forms tray again because it had gotten low while she was gone, and she answered 3 intake calls between 2 and 2:45, and she thought, reasonably, that the strangest part of her day was over. At 3:12 p.m., a man in a dark suit walked into the Hargrove Regional Medical Center and asked for her by name, not by her job title, not the intake clerk. Her name, first and last, Sloane Merritt. Beverly, who was at the desk when he said it, looked at Sloane with an expression that Sloane recognized but hadn't seen directed at herself in a long time. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. Sloane set down the form she was holding. "I'll take my break now," she said. There were 2 of them. The one who had asked for her, Pharaoh, early 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of trim that doesn't come from a gym membership, and a younger woman who introduced herself as Agent Cass and stood slightly behind and to the left of him with a tablet and a stillness that Sloane recognized. They sat in the family consultation room. It smelled like the fake lavender from the diffuser that someone had plugged in near the door and which Sloane had always found slightly hostile. "You saved his life," Pharaoh said. It wasn't a compliment. It was the opening line of an interrogation. "The physician saved his life," Sloane said. "I bought him 4 minutes. That's not a skill most people have. I've taken first aid courses." Pharaoh looked at her. Then he opened the folder on the table between them. "Sloane Merritt," he read, though she was fairly sure he didn't need to read it. Age 29. No prior medical employment. Associate degree from a community college in Martinsburg, completed 6 years ago. Before that, he turned a page. Nothing we can find. Sloane kept her hands flat on her thighs, where no one could see whether they were still. They were still. "I had a quiet few years," she said. "Apparently." He turned another page. "The procedure you performed. Needle thoracostomy, correct placement, correct gauge. That's not something you learn in a first aid course, Ms. Merritt. That's not something most first-year residents do correctly on the first try. Maybe I'm a fast learner." Agent Cass, who hadn't spoken yet, looked up from her tablet. She had the eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for long enough that they had developed a sixth sense for it. She didn't say anything. She just looked. Sloane had sat across from people like that before, in different rooms, in different countries. "Is Staff Sergeant Orrin going to be okay?" she asked. Pharaoh blinked. It was the first thing she'd said that had surprised him. "He's in surgery. I know. Is he going to be okay?" A pause. "The surgeon says yes. Good." She folded her hands on the table. "Then I'm not sure I understand what I can help you with." "Caleb Orrin is not just a staff sergeant," Pharaoh said. "He's been part of a classified joint task force that has been operational for the past 18 months. The fact that he was on leave in West Virginia, passing through Clarksburg on a Tuesday afternoon, that's not public information. The fact that he was injured is not public information. The fact that someone without any verifiable medical training successfully performed a field decompression procedure that appears on page 47 of a classified combat casualty care protocol." He tapped the folder. "That is a problem that requires explanation." Sloane looked at the folder. She looked at Pharaoh. She looked at Agent Cass, who was still just looking back at her with that particular kind of patience. Then Sloane took a slow breath. "Close the door," she said. Pharaoh raised an eyebrow but didn't move. Cass closed the door. "How deep does your clearance go?" Sloane asked. "Deep enough," Pharaoh said. That's not an answer. He considered her for a moment. Then he said a code designation that she hadn't heard spoken out loud in 4 years, and the air in the room changed slightly, or maybe that was just Sloane, settling into something she had been very carefully not being for 7 months. "Okay," she said. Then I'll tell you where I learned it. She had been a 68W, a combat medic. She'd enlisted at 21 because she had nothing holding her in Clarksburg and a talent for staying calm in situations that made other people come apart, and the Army had recognized that talent quickly and moved her somewhere it could be useful. She didn't say where. Farrow didn't ask. She'd spent 5 years doing things in places that don't appear on standard deployment records. She'd been attached to units that didn't officially exist, in theaters that weren't officially active, treating injuries that weren't officially sustained. She had performed battlefield procedures in the back of vehicles and on dirt floors, and once in a drainage ditch, in conditions that she would describe only as suboptimal. She had been very good at her job. Then a mission in year 5 had gone wrong in a way that wasn't her fault and wasn't anybody's fault, and also cost 3 people their lives. And Sloane had come home and quietly filed her discharge paperwork and moved back to Clarksburg and gotten a job at the front desk of the hospital she'd been born in, because she needed to be somewhere that nothing she did would get anyone killed. She had needed to be ordinary for a while. How long? Agent Cass asked. It was the first thing she'd said, and she said it quietly, like she understood the weight of it. Sloane looked at her. Long enough. And today? Sloane thought about Caleb Oren's chest, the way it had stopped moving, the way the room had been very loud and also completely useless in that particular second. He was going to die, she said simply. Right there, in 4 minutes. Farrow leaned forward. And you couldn't let that happen. Nobody could have let that happen, Sloane said. I was just the only person in the room who knew what to do about it. There was a long pause. The procedure you used, Farrow said, the specific placement, the specific gauge, that's from a protocol that was updated 8 months ago. The previous version specified a different approach. You used the new version. He let that sit there for a second, which was never publicly released. Sloane didn't answer right away. Outside the door, the hospital continued its hospital sounds. A call button, wheels on linoleum, someone's voice on an overhead page, all of it distant and clean. I keep current, she said finally. How? She looked at the table. I have friends. The conversation that followed was not short. Farrow went through the folder carefully, page by page, stopping at things she wasn't going to explain and moving past them when she didn't. Cass took notes on her tablet with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that what was being said and what was being left unsaid were both part of the record. They asked about her network. She told them it was small and personal and completely non-operational for 4 years. They asked about her access to classified materials. She told them she had none, officially. They asked about the specific source of the updated protocol. She told them a name, a first name only, someone she'd served with who had transitioned to a different kind of work, and who occasionally, in the course of long phone calls that they had every 3 or 4 months to make sure each other were still alive, mentioned things that were useful to know. The name made Agent Cass stop typing. Farrow leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. That individual, he said carefully, is currently listed as unreachable. I know, Sloane said. We talked 2 months ago. Another pause. Longer this time. We're going to need that phone number, Farrow said. I know that too. She gave it to them. She had known, when she sat down in this room, that she was going to give it to them eventually. Because the alternative was a much longer conversation in a much less comfortable room. And also because, whatever her friend was into now, the fact that 2 CIA agents with that clearance level were looking for her was the kind of information her friend would want to have. Farrow wrote the number down. Cass sent something on her tablet. Is there anything else? Sloane asked. We'll likely need to follow up, Farrow said. I assumed. Is there anything you need from us? Sloane thought about it, actually thought about it. No, she said. I don't think so. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her lanyard. She pushed her chair back in. One more thing, Farrow said. She stopped. You could have walked away, he said. When that ambulance came in, you weren't obligated. Sloane looked at him for a moment. She thought about the sound the air had made when it finally moved through the right space. She thought about Caleb Oren's chest rising. No, she said. I really couldn't have. She opened the door and walked back out into the hallway. Beverly was waiting for her. Not obviously. She was charting at the nurse's station, which was her job. And she didn't look up when Sloane came back to the desk. But she had positioned herself so that she was within speaking distance, and Sloane understood that this was deliberate. You okay? Beverly said, still looking at her chart. Yes. Those men give you any trouble? No. Beverly made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite skepticism. Then she said, Oren's out of surgery. Dr. Keene says the next 24 hours will tell it, but he's optimistic. Sloane nodded. Good. His sister's in the waiting room. She drove up from Roanoke. Beverly paused. She asked if she could speak with whoever helped him. Sloane was quiet for a moment. Tell her I'm glad he made it, she said. Tell her he's got good people looking after him. Beverly looked up then, just briefly. She had been a nurse for 23 years, and she had seen a lot of people in a lot of different moments. And whatever she saw in Sloane's face in that second, she decided to leave alone. I'll tell her, she said. Sloane picked up the stack of intake forms. The tray was low again. She refilled it. She answered the next call that came in, and the one after that. She processed 4 walk-in admissions between 4 and 6, and she argued mildly with the pharmacy technician about a faxed prescription that wasn't legible. And she ate a granola bar at her desk around 5:30 because she'd missed lunch. She did not think in any meaningful way about what had happened that afternoon. Or rather, she thought about it exactly as much as it required, which was enough to know that Caleb Oren was breathing and that whatever came next would come next, and that the rest of it was not hers to carry home. At 6:45, her shift ended. She signed out. She put on her coat. She walked through the ambulance bay because it was the fastest route to the parking lot, and the night air outside was cold and tasted like October leaves and distant rain. She sat in her car for a moment. She thought about calling her friend, the one whose name she had given to Agent Farrow, the one who was apparently unreachable by government standards, but who had picked up on the second ring 2 months ago when Sloane called from a rest stop on I-79 at 11 at night because she'd had a bad dream about the drainage ditch. She decided not to call tonight. Her friend would hear about it soon enough, through channels that moved faster and stranger than anything Sloane could control, and they would talk when they talked. That was how it had always worked. She started the car. She drove home through Clarksburg, past the diner on 2nd Street where she ate breakfast on Sundays, past the library where she returned her books a day late every single time without exception, past the intersection where she always caught the light. She caught the light. She sat there in the red glow and thought about nothing in particular, and then the light turned green, and she drove the rest of the way home. She hung her coat on the hook by the door. She washed her hands properly this time, all the way up to the elbow, the way she'd been taught, with the soap lathered in and rinsed 3 times. She made dinner. She had to be back at the desk by 7 in the morning, and the intake forms tray would be low again by 9. And someone would need coffee before 10, and in all probability, none of it would require anything more complicated than what she had agreed 7 months ago to do. She was fine with that. She had been fine with that for 7 months. She heated up soup on the stove and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark street and the orange streetlight reflecting in the puddle at the bottom of her driveway, and she thought, not for the first time and not with any particular feeling about it, it's enough to do good where you are. She ate her soup. She went to bed. In a hospital 3 miles away, a man named Caleb Oren breathed in and out all night without assistance. The monitors steady, the readings clean, his sister asleep in the chair beside him with her head resting on her folded arms, the way people sit with someone when they are not yet ready to believe they don't have to worry anymore. Nobody sent Sloane a medal. She hadn't expected one.